Bon dia a tothom, ara sí. Vicerectora, membres de l'equip de Degana i del Departament d'Humanitats que avui ens acompanyen, professorat i estudiants dels graus d'Humanitats i Global Studies, personal d'administració i serveis de l'UGA d'Humanitats, amics i amigues dels nostres estudis. Gràcies per ser aquí, per trobar aquest moment per iniciar plegats un nou curs que esperem que sigui intens, ple d'idees, de projectes i d'aprenentatges compartits i que ens ajudi a créixer com a persones i també com a comunitat. Aquest acte d'inauguració és una trobada de tota la nostra Facultat d'Humanitats, de tota la nostra comunitat, del professorat, del personal de gestió tècnic i d'administració, que és un pilar essencial perquè la nostra activitat acadèmica funcioni, i molt especialment de l'alumnat dels estudis de Global i Humanitats. És un dels pocs espais que tenim per fer comunitat, per retrobar-nos i per compartir allò que ens uneix. Amb aquest acte donem començament oficial al curs i reafirmem allò que ens dona sentit com a humanistes i com a comunitat a la nostra universitat, la Universitat Pompeu Fabra. El compromís amb el coneixement, amb el pensament crític, amb la cultura i amb la defensa dels drets humans i de la justícia social, aquí, a casa nostra i també a escala global. En un temps obscur, marcat per la fragmentació, la desigualtat, la desinformació, la guerra i el genocidi, que continuen produint-se davant la indiferència global, les humanitats ens recorden que el coneixement no pot desvincular-se de la responsabilitat ni del compromís col·lectiu. L'acte d'aquest any vol ser precisament una manera de dir, amb serenitat però també amb molta convicció, que volem una universitat o unes universitats públiques que siguin espais de creació i transmissió de coneixement, de recerca i de docència, però també de diàleg, de debat i de compromís amb la societat i amb el món que ens envolta. No volem universitats tancades en torres de marfil. La nostra facultat, la nostra universitat, que és una institució pública i, per tant, al servei de la societat, ha d'estar convençuda de la força transformadora de l'educació i de la cultura com a fonaments de la convivència democràtica. I per fer-ho tangible, per fer tangible aquestes idees, hem volgut posar-los veu i rostre amb aquesta lliçó inaugural del curs 25-26 amb un convidat molt especial que més tard us presentarem. L'acte inaugural del curs és també un moment de benvinguda per a tots aquells que retornem després de les vacances, però molt especialment per als nous membres que a partir d'aquest any s'integren a la nostra comunitat. Vull donar la benvinguda més cordial als i les estudiants de nou ingrés dels graus d'Humanitats i Global Studies. Comenceu aquest curs un camí que estic segura i espero serà molt important en les vostres vides. També vull donar la benvinguda als nous professors i professores que s'han incorporat recentment als nostres estudis, a l'Almudena Blasco, a la Libera Pisano, a l'Stefano Bellini i al Daniel Esparza. Benvinguts i benvingudes a totes i tots. Ens alegra molt que sigueu part d'aquesta ara també la vostra comunitat. Aquest acte és també una ocasió per mirar enrere i fer balanç del que hem fet fins ara. El curs 24-25 ha estat molt intens. Ha estat un curs amb molta feina, però també un curs molt productiu. I volia aprofitar aquest moment per reconèixer i posar en valor la feina de tot l'equip de deganat. Durant el curs passat, a més de la gestió quotidiana, que és sovint molt invisible però necessària, hem volgut afrontar qüestions estratègiques i de futur per a la nostra facultat. Una d'aquestes línies de treball ha estat la modificació del Pla d'Estudis del Grau en Humanitats. És un projecte amb què volem donar respostes als nous reptes del segle XXI, però sense perdre allò que ens defineix i l'esperit fundacional dels nostres estudis. Ha estat una tasca important, llarga, però sobretot col·lectiva. Per això vull agrair sincerament la feina de tot el professorat, del personal d'administració i gestió i dels estudiants per la seva implicació, el seu compromís i el seu temps. I també expressar un agraïment molt especial als membres de l'equip de deganat, a la Meritxell Ferrer, la Núria Fernández Rius i el Simone Ventura, que han coordinat tot aquest procés. Aquest treball s'ha complementat amb un altre projecte que avança en paral·lel, un nou grau que vol connectar el coneixement humanístic amb la comunicació, la cultura i la tecnologia. És una aposta, esperem valenta, que mira endavant i que vol situar les humanitats al centre dels grans debats contemporanis: la intel·ligència artificial, la cultura digital, la creativitat, la sostenibilitat i la diversitat. Esperem tenir aviat un esborrany complet del nou grau, que per ara es diu de Creació Digital, Cultura i Tecnologia, per compartir-lo i debatre'l amb tot el professorat de la Facultat d'Humanitats, incorporant noves mirades i aportacions que l'enriqueixin. La preparació d'aquest nou grau ha estat també una oportunitat per repensar què vol dir fer humanitats avui. Vivim en un moment paradoxal. Mentre moltes veus alerten amb raó del perill de posar en dubte el coneixement científic, com el doctor Joan Massaguer ens va explicar el dia de l'acte inaugural de la Universitat Pompeu Fabra, sovint s'oblida que des dels mateixos sectors es desqualifiquen no només la ciència, sinó també el valor del coneixement humanístic. Les humanitats són essencials per entendre el món i per donar sentit a l'experiència humana. Sense història, sense filosofia, sense llengua, sense literatura, sense art, no hi ha manera d'interpretar el present ni d'imaginar futurs possibles. Per això hem de defensar les humanitats, no només com un àmbit acadèmic, sinó com una manera d'estar al món, de viure al món, de mirar, d'escoltar, de tenir memòries, de reconèixer identitats. I és precisament des d'aquest lloc, des d'aquesta mirada humanista, que no podem restar en silenci davant del que està passant a Gaza. El passat mes de juliol, més d'un centenar de membres del Departament d'Humanitats vam signar un comunicat de condemna al genocidi de Gaza. En aquest text s'afirmava amb claredat: assistim sense actuar a un genocidi retransmès en directe per les seves pròpies víctimes i pels botxins, sense que la comunitat internacional sigui capaç de posar-li fi. Aquestes paraules expressen la impotència, però també la lucidesa d'una comunitat acadèmica que no vol ser còmplice d'aquest silenci. Les humanitats no podem ser neutrals davant la barbàrie, perquè també el silenci és una forma de violència. Com a facultat tenim la responsabilitat de defensar la vida, però també la cultura, la memòria i la paraula, tots ells objectius d'aquesta guerra genocida. Aquest comunicat també deia: ha arribat el moment de deixar constància de com la universitat contribueix i contribuirà a impedir la perpetuació de la barbàrie i de com està contribuint a protegir, escoltar i cuidar totes les víctimes. Aquestes paraules del comunicat ens van interpel·lar com a equip de deganat, com a representants institucionals de la nostra comunitat, i per això vam considerar que aquest acte inaugural del curs 2025-26, havia de ser una manera de donar veu a aquestes víctimes, de trencar amb aquest silenci, d'escoltar i de compartir el seu testimoni. I per això avui comptem amb la presència d'un convidat d'honor, que és l'escriptor i periodista palestí Mohamad Kayyal, que per raons òbvies no pot ser aquí, però que l'escoltarem en streaming. Ell està a Haifa esperant que obrim la connexió, i que serà la persona que donarà la lliçó inaugural del curs 25-26. La presentació del Mohamad Kayyal la farà el nostre segon convidat de la lliçó inaugural d'avui, el Mohamad Bitari, que és traductor i escriptor. Gràcies a tothom, i no vull acabar sense demanar-vos que després de l'acte no marxeu, perquè tenim un petit refrigeri preparat amb una mica de cava per brindar pel nou curs.
Yo creo que quiere que tú le presentes.
Esta tengo. Bon dia. Gràcies a la Universitat Pompeu Fabra. Em fa molt feliç avui estar amb vosaltres a la inauguració d'aquest curs. I avui presentaré a Majd Kayyal. مرحبا مجد، ما بعرف إذا
مرحبا، كيف؟
شايفني.
Hello everyone.
كيف أخبارك؟ صباح الخير.
صباح الورد.
Per tant, Joan Majd fa anys, començo a parlar perquè m'agrada sempre començar amb històries i narratives perquè tot té un context narratiu, no? I fa anys jo he llegit la primera novel·la de Majd Kayyal, la primera novel·la que va sortir el 2000, o es va publicar el 2017, es diu La tragèdia d'en Saeid Mattar, que també l'he traduït al català el 2023 amb altre traductor, amb l'Ismael Profitós. Però amb Majd teníem molts amics en comú i jo després de llegir la novel·la he començat a traduir directament. I després he dit, perquè a Haifa tinc molts amics, estic en contacte amb la cultura i amb la literatura de Palestina. Això també és una altra història per als palestins exiliats, perquè sempre intentem estar en contacte amb la nostra també context natural, no? I vaig aconseguir el número de telèfon del Majd Kayyal i li vaig trucar i li he dit, estàvem parlant de drets, d'agafar els drets d'autor, etc. I m'ha dit, sí, cap problema, no passa res, pots traduir el llibre. I l'he dit després, al final de la trucada, l'he dit, pràcticament ja la novel·la està traduïda, ja està acabada. I ell va estar com molt... va tenir una sorpresa molt gran en aquell temps. Jo crec que Majd Kayyal és un dels nostres escriptors palestins que marquen la literatura contemporània palestina. Si li preguntem al Majd diu que no, però jo com una persona acadèmica literària sempre dic que Majd Kayyal és un dels nostres escriptors contemporanis més important. Després va publicar el Majd Kayyal altre llibre que és de contes, de narrativa breu, es diu Mort a Haifa. És el conte que van publicar fa molt poc, el primer conte, l'avenç, l'últim número. I després va publicar l'últim llibre, el Mort a Haifa és el 2019, i després va publicar el riu Carmelo. Com podem entendre? Majd Kayyal és de la generació 90 de l'Orient. No, està bé? La veu? No? Sí? I Majd Kayyal és d'una generació dels 90, és una generació molt marcada en el Mashriq, perquè jo crec que l'Orient Mitjà és un terme molt colonialista que no utilitzem a l'Orient. Per tant, d'aquest moment utilitzo la següent paraula, el Mashriq. El Mashriq és com l'Orient per nosaltres. No? Però també tenim altre terme que es diu Bilad Sham, o els països del Sham. Els països del Sham són Palestina, Líban, Jordània i Síria. Majd Kayyal és de la generació 90, la generació 90 que va viure. Pràcticament és la generació que també ha participat o d'on va sortir les revolucions a Síria. Són dels anys 90, pràcticament, 90, 89, 88. I per entendre Majd Kayyal, últimament estava pensant d'una pregunta que em va fer una periodista a un programa de ràdio quan va començar la literatura palestina. La periodista m'estava demanant una com data concreta de quan va començar la literatura palestina. Jo crec que no podem tractar la literatura palestina sense tractar la literatura àrab. I quan parlem de la literatura àrab, no és que la literatura escrita per als àrabs, perquè tenim escriptors molt potents, com kurds i amazigh, que van escriure en àrab, com per exemple Salim Barakat. Salim Barakat, quan va escriure amb la llengua àrab, ha arribat molt lluny, més que els àrabs també en dominar la llengua. Per tant, Majd Kayyal, no podem entendre Majd Kayyal com escriptor i com una persona literària sense també entendre la literatura àrab i sense entendre també el context dels palestins, perquè Majd Kayyal viu a Haifa, i a Haifa, avui de dia, els palestins són una minoria. No? Però Majd Kayyal, jo crec que cal llegir a Hussein al-Barghouti per anar a Majd Kayyal, perquè jo crec que a Palestina avui de dia tenim dos escriptors que són los herederos, sempre dic això, de Hussein al-Barghouti. Hussein el Barghouti no està traduït al català, no està traduït al castellà, però té un llibre molt important, està traduït a l'anglès, es diu Llum Blava, és dels nostres escriptors més important de la història contemporània. No? Jo crec que Majd Kayyal, no sé si ell està d'acord amb mi o no, ell està llegint ara, crec, la traducció i després ho podem parlar, però jo crec que Majd Kayyal és un dels... és una continuació, és una persona que està jugant amb el seu estil també contemporani, junt amb altres persones, també amb un altre escriptor palestí, també és de Haifa, però avui m'agradaria parlar només sobre l'escriptura de Majd. I Majd, també cal conèixer Majd, a la meva opinió, per conèixer la seva literatura. Perquè Majd té una personalitat de com, jo sempre dic, com caçador de contes i d'històries. Vol dir, posar Majd en un context en qualsevol ciutat i ja comença a buscar històries. I jo crec que Majd Kayyal, el llibre, per exemple, aquest, és l'únic llibre que tenim en català, la tragèdia d'en Saeid Mattar, que a mi m'agrada molt l'estil, però necessita paciència, necessita un lector, no? Perquè comença Majd Kayyal a capturar, no? Escenes de la ciutat i a vegades és com no entenem del que està parlant fins al final, perquè Majd Kayyal és ja en si mateix, és una persona que viu la literatura. No només escriu contes, és que tot comença amb Majd Kayyal des de la realitat. Jo mai he anat a Palestina, però m'agradaria un dia anar a Palestina quan tinc la nacionalitat espanyola. Només per entendre una part de Majd Kayyal quan parla de llocs, per exemple. I això és una experiència que ho he fet de llegir escriptors àrabs i després anar als llocs o bars que han parlat dins de la seva literatura. I a vegades vaig tenir una decepció, no? Perquè dins del conte o dins de la novel·la el lloc és molt més important o molt més bonic que en realitat, pràcticament. No? Per tant, no vull parlar més perquè crec que ha parlat bastant. Us deixo amb Majd i estic també feliç pràcticament que Majd està arribant a la societat també i als lectors catalans. I si em deixeu parlar l'últim punt, la literatura palestina no tota és una literatura sobre la causa. És molt més important, molt més barrejada que això. I jo crec que amb Majd Kayyal hem parlat d'això. La causa ha agafat un espai, un lloc molt important dins de la literatura palestina. Però els palestins escriuen més n'hi ha també que això. بتركك مجد مع الأصدقاء اللي موجودين هون. ما بعرف إذا قرأت أو يعني الترجمة أو متفق معي ببعض الأشياء بعدين ممكن فينا نحكي فيها. سي سي. عندك مسكر
كنت اقول اني ما انتبهت للترجمه، ما قرات الترجمه، بس يعني كل ثقه بشو حكيت رغم
شكرا.
سامحني.
طب اتركك معهم هلا. Os deixo amb el Majd Kayyal y muchas gracias per escoltar-me. Gràcies.
Thank you, Bitari. Is it my turn now? Okay. Hello, good morning. Thank you, everyone. I'm honored to be with you today in this event, in this opening. I want to start with thanking Professor Maria, Professor Linda, and thanking also Bitari for this introduction. I always feel safe when Mohamad Bitari is around, but he keeps put my name with the other names of great Palestinian writers that I appreciate, and he always stress me out. So I always start with a little bit of fear and stress. But thank you again for having me here. I'm glad to speak to you, and I'm happy to be here with you despite the horrible and the very difficult situation we are facing in Palestine now, and especially our brothers and sisters in Gaza. It's refreshing. It gives energy. It gives power. It gives a lot of feeling of solidarity and feeling of brotherhood, maybe, to be able to speak to people who are interested in Palestinian literature, in Arab literature, and generally in liberatory literature, literature of liberation, of struggles, literature of some sort of desire and motivation to challenge the current domination in our world. So thank you again, and I will start with two things. First, let's hope that the connection keeps being good for the whole lecture. And the second thing is that I have an alcoholic neighbor that always knocks my door whenever I'm having a talk to ask me existential questions. So let's hope he doesn't do that today. I want today to share with you two main ideas related to each other, maybe even similar. The first one is about literature in general. Before speaking about Palestinian literature, I think we cannot do that without talking about the idea and what we think and how do we reflect and think of literature in general. And the idea I want to share with you today and discuss with you today is thinking and reflecting on literature as a living organism, as a living social and political organism and movement that we are part of. And I'm saying that because it's crucial for us to understand that literature is not some sort of space of reproduction of identities and reproduction of expressions and storytelling and narrative, but it's also a space and sphere for conflict. It's sphere for paradoxes, for conflicts, for struggles that are shaping the history of literature. And it's important to understand so because we live in an era where literature is disarmed of philosophy. Literature is disarmed from history. Literature is disarmed from its ability to be part of social, political, economical conflicts, and maybe just to reflect them or to express them without understanding that culture and literature, especially, is a product of domination. It's a product of dynamics of power. It's a product of social and political and economical structure, and it's also reproducing them as well. So this is the first notion that I want to start with and talk about it a little bit. And the second notion is related to Palestinian literature in general, because there is a problem that we face today that Palestinian literature is either ignored totally, or it's dealt with as some sort of a holy spirit that expresses the struggle and the Palestinian narrative and the Palestinian suffer, etc., etc. And it's some sort of victims literature that its only aim is to represent the story and prove that the Palestinians have some sort of right and historical right and are telling the facts and telling the truth. So what I want us to talk about today regarding Palestinian literature is how to understand Palestinian literature differently. How to understand Palestinian literature as a sphere for conflicts and paradoxes that can be in itself a colonizer literature, and it's in itself a colonized literature, and can be a reactionary literature, and can be a liberation literature, and can be a lot of things and dynamics at the same time. And this is what is actually make it a literature. In a world, especially a Western world, but not only that, that always want to perceive and understand Palestinian literature as something solid, as something that comes only to tell a story of suffering, as something that has one single aim, which is to prove to the Western world that we have the right in the historical narrative and that we existed before Israel and that we have the right to live without being genocide and ethnic cleansed and killed. And from those 2 points, I think that we can start developing our questions about, okay, so in this situation, what is a literature of liberation? Not a Palestinian literature, because Palestinian literature can be as well reactionary. It can also obey to the colonizers. It can obey to the Palestinian Authority. It can obey to corrupted people. It can obey to different sorts of power. But to think Palestine as thinking liberation, as thinking a liberatory literature that actually challenged the rules and challenged the reality of cultural world and cultural sphere, not only in Palestine, but in all the Arab world and also worldwide. So from those 2 questions, we need to try to develop some sort of an idea and a question of what is it today to write from a perspective and motivation of liberation. And I find myself all these sort of thoughts that can sometimes seem a little bit, too literally or too philosophical, or I don't know what. I find them come from a very simple place for me in my personal life. And they are always related to my grandmother, Salime. Salime, God bless her, she died 8 years ago. She was a woman from the Galilee, from Arabi, that witnessed the Nakba, the Exodus, the War of 48, and the creation of the state of Israel on the ruins of our people, on the ruins of more than 500 Palestinian villages. And she witnessed many episodes of our history. She witnessed the War of 67. She witnessed the displacement. She witnessed the land confiscation later. She witnessed the military rule. She witnessed the big strike of 76, which we called Land Day. She witnessed the first Intifada. She lived it all. And I have uncles that were political activists, journalists, academic, all this package of trying to do something in their life. And in these sorts of activism and work, we always had visitors, journalists or students or delegations of solidarity movements that comes to our big family house in the Galilee, wanting to know things, wanting to learn about Palestine, wanting to learn about the narrative. And despite all the explanations that they had and the information that they had, they always looked at my grandmother and waited for her to tell the authentic story, you know, to tell the exotic, authentic story of the woman who lived it all. And she didn't give a matter about it. She didn't care about it. She didn't care to speak to anyone who has blonde hair and green eyes, and she didn't want to speak about it. It's not because she's traumatized. I'm sure she is, but it's not because of that. She just didn't feel any need to tell the story. She didn't feel any need to prove anything to anyone. And within time, she was a very interesting woman because she, for example, she used to every day read the two newspapers of the Communist Party and of the Nationalists, Palestinian, every day to open the newspaper, stare at the newspaper for hours, although she was analphabetic and she couldn't read at all. But for some reason, she used to do that every day. And within time, I noticed that she started lying and telling stories that are not true about Land Day, about this, about that. And she just used the occasions of European and Americans coming to visit the village to tell them bullshit, to invent stories from her own imagination and make herself laugh and make me and my brother and everyone laugh. And from these occasions, I started to understand and to observe the difference between telling a story in order to prove yourself to someone, in order to get a recognition from someone, to be seen by someone, to get a recognition of your suffer, of your pain, of your history, of your truth that you know, that you witnessed as a person, as a child. And between other form of story and other form of expression, that its goal is to entertain yourself, is to liberate yourself from the burden of telling the story. It's to imagine other possibilities that you could live. It's to imagine different scenarios, different lives, different weird things that you could say without judging yourself, and it comes on solely from your heart, from your imagination, from your fantasies, from your desires, from everything else. And I thought that there is two sorts of stories that are being told. And this is a very main contradiction in understanding Palestinian history. Now, before cutting to talk about Palestinian history, let's take few minutes just to try and establish a common ground on literature in general. Sorry. And again, what I want us to try to think and reflect is that literature as a living organism and movement that is stuck in a historical moment. Some call it the end of history. End of history. Which the literature to some extent and to far extent is unphilosophized. It's disarmed from its ability to think philosophically. It's contained and subjected to a consumerist, industrial aspect, capitalist domination over the literary structure in the whole world. And it obeys to the rules of professionalism, of division of labor. And we reach to a point where the forms and structures of literature, the rituals of literature, the ritual of how we consume literature, how we write, the three parts of writing, publishing, and reading are dominated by hegemony, by ideology of capitalist consumerism and industry of literature, where the form is for granted, where the form is assumed, the form of literature. How do we write? How do we publish? How should the book be like? What is the structure, the dramatic structure of a novel? The rituals of book launching and signing, the starhood of the writer as the center of the literary work, book fairs, residencies, prizes, translators, publishers, the whole package that turn literature into a professional industry, that turns us as writers into careerists. Like, we have a career in writing, we have a career in translation, and this is the profession that we work with. This is the first area, or this is the place where literature is actually disconnected from other issues and other subjects in our life. Literature becomes a specific profession, disconnected from economy, from sociology, from politics, from gender issues, from many causes, many aspects of life, of understanding history of literature, philosophy, even science, even archaeology. All these sorts of knowledge that actually form a human knowledge and philosophy that can be motivating or generating the urge to write and to produce literature. And it flips upside down the whole relationship with writing, and turn writing in itself as some sort of profession, of some sort of work, that when you read and when you learn and when you watch movies and when you hear music, you are doing that in order to be able to produce literature and then to be accepted for this residency and this translated by this translator and take this prize, etc. So we are talking about an era in literature where the form is for granted and what we are creating is content. It's exactly like social media. It's like social media has become the god of literature, where the forms are already given. When the creation of literature is not a recreation of form, of how do we produce a book, how do we introduce a book to the reader, how do we read, how do we translate, how do we publish, all these structures, including the traditional conservative structure of the dramatic pyramid, this five parts, 5 acts, 5 act structure. And you are reading books that just copies of a Netflix TV shows wannabe. And what we create is content. We don't have the ability to read, to challenge the form. And when you reach the point that where what you create is the content, especially for us as Palestinians, as Arabs, as people of the East, as people of maybe even Latin America, of Africa, of Asia, of not the center, okay, not Europe and not the US, what we start to create in this content is our identity. We start reproducing our identity, reproducing the cliches that people have about us, play with those cliches, introducing our history. And usually we do that by going to the elderly people and deal with them like some sort of a resource, of a wheel of resource that you only want to take more and more oral history from them, more and more stories, more and more witnesses, in order to reproduce some sort of content to feed the machine of Western centralism for literature. So we are not even writing for ourselves anymore. We are not even writing in order to enjoy and entertain ourselves with joking around with literature, with enjoying changing the forms and changing the language and creating new words and creating new sounds and creating new forms of books, of writing, of journals, and we are stuck in a place where each one of us has his own very specific, very narrow profession. This is a poet. This is something is happening here with the camera. This is a poet, this is a novelist, this is a children books writer, this is a science fiction writer, and we all move or live in small boxes of producing literature of identity, of what is our history and what is the suffer that my grandmother lived and what is the suffer that today. Same thing in Gaza, for example. Today, people are in Gaza, okay, let's take more and more story of suffer. Let's take more and more stories of how people survived and how people feel and how people felt, etc. And let's reproduce them in movies, in TV shows, in books, in short stories. From this point of view, it's crucial to understand Palestinian literature and the paradoxes and the conflicts of Palestinian literature. In Palestine, generally, and I'm not talking about literature only, let's talk wider a little bit. There is an assumption that the conflict between us and the Zionists is a conflict over narrative, over discourse, over how do we tell the story and how we prove our facts and our narratives. There is an assumption that if we want to gain our rights, and if we want to gain our liberty and our freedom, our human rights, equality, dignity, we need to convince the Europeans and the Americans that we had rights and we existed before the colonialism, and that we had a life of education and culture, etc., in Palestine even before the Nakba. And it's true to some extent because the whole existence of the Zionist project, of the colonialism in Palestine, is based upon a narrative, a colonialist Western narrative, that says that this land was empty. There was some Arab nomads here, but it was an empty land. And we, the Europeans, the white, educated, civilized, came and flourished. The desert blossomed the desert, and we made the cities, and we brought the culture, and we brought this and that and that. And even when they talk about the Nakba, about the refugees, the narrative is that we did not ethnic cleanse the place, they just escaped. We want them to stay, but they choose because we love living in refugee camps and in tents. We choose to flee to Syria and to Lebanon and to Jordan. This is the Zionist narrative. And for a long time, especially Palestinians in the Western diaspora, in the United States and in Europe, tried to challenge this narrative with bringing alternative Palestinian narrative, bringing the Palestinian truth to the audience. But this wasn't the whole Palestinian culture. This wasn't the whole Palestinian discourse, let's call it. But as you know, I'm sure that most of you know, the Palestinian politics and Palestinian social structure and life in general has shifted in a very crucial turning point, which is the late 80s, early 90s. Those are the years that in the whole world, things shifted into a globalized, cosmopolitan era of diplomacy and era of democratization, etc., etc. And it happened everywhere in the world, not only in Palestine. Even you in Barcelona, you had this, if I'm not mistaken, you had those years the building for the Olympics and turning the city into a cosmopolitan, globalized city and erasing some of its identity, of its history, of its culture. It happened everywhere in the world. And in Palestine, it's a process that started with the end of the siege in Beirut, the surrender, the moving of the PLO, the Palestinian Liberation Movement, into Tunisia, and then started the so-called peace talks that took several years, reaching into the Oslo Accords in '93. And the main transformation there was that the ideology of struggle, the ideology of armed struggle, it's not about armed, it's about a mentality of struggle where people grow up in the refugee camps to understand their education, their knowledge, their doing, their activism, everything in their life as some sort of a journey for the liberation and freedom of Palestine and the return of the refugees. And the Palestinian existence began some sort of obsession with diplomacy, with globalizing Palestine, with being able to approach the West. And in the end of the day, it was the moment, the historical moment, where the Palestinian cause was swollen by the Western and the liberal, if you want to call it, side of the globe. And this is where the need for proving ourselves, for proving our truth and bringing our narrative and fighting over our narrative became the main goal and the main obsession of the Palestinian discourse. Because even the political literature before that, in the 60s and the 70s, was more busy in thinking literature, even when it's political and even when even when it's very political, it was more occupied with how to create a collective narrative that can push forward the struggle for liberation. Okay, even when we told the stories of the Nakba and when we told the stories of the struggle in the 60s and the 70s, we were more focused on how to create a collective identity, a collective narrative, a collective imagination that can bring us closer to liberation. But the shift that we had in the 90s is the shift toward creating some sort or living some sort of obsession in proving that we were here before the Nakba, that we had cities before the Nakba, that we had culture before the Nakba of 48, that we were uprooted forcibly and displaced forcibly from our houses and got choose to live in a tent in Lebanon. And this came, we have to understand that this came in some sort of a gap between our abilities as a people under occupation and under colonialism, our abilities in archiving. Most of the Palestinians' archives were destroyed by the Israelis, by the way, in Jordan, in Lebanon, etc., and even in the West Bank. Our weakness in academy, because the academic life in Palestine and abroad was always attacked and always oppressed. And the orientation, our main power and our main attempts to move toward something were mainly within our openness and within like the openness of Western academia to receiving more Palestinians and more Palestinians from the West Bank, from Gaza, from 48, all of them like starting to go to the Western Academy in the US in Haifa and started to talking about and developing the idea of oral history, and let's rebuild our archive and rewrite our history through oral history, etc. And then, of course, campaigns of interviewing old people in order to ensure and in order to prove that we were there and to prove our narrative, etc., etc. But within this weakness of confronting the Israeli narrative that is well established in the West, literature has took the biggest burden in proving the narrative. Literature has become a central tool for Palestinians to prove that guys, we swear we existed here. Okay, and it's funny because it's colonial. It's sometimes by itself, because, for example, they say there was no Palestine, there was no culture in Palestine, there was no cities in Palestine, there were barbaric nomad, or I don't know what. So what you need to, as a historian or a writer or something, you need to prove is that we had cities exactly like the West. We had theater exactly like the West. We had orchestra exactly like the West. We had our women wore skirts exactly like the West. Our men wore tuxedos exactly like. So your way to prove that you deserve rights, that you deserve not to be genocide and ethnically cleansed, is to prove that you are like the Western people. You are like the Europeans, that even in 48 we had photographers and we had cinematographers and we had musicians and we all that. Like if we were just fallahin, just peasants who work in their land, we don't deserve life and we deserve being kicked out of our houses and our lands and our 500 villages to be destroyed. Okay? This is the point where Palestinian literature actually gets into some sort of paradox. Because in a way, this is the very human and very right thing to do. If you believe that your people is in struggle and you want to do your part. But in the same time, you are imprisoned in this sort of writing that is actually keeps reproducing content to prove a narrative and a story for your people. You are in a place that you cannot even liberate yourself to write the fiction that bears lies, fantasy, desires, questions that can be very harsh and very provocative for Palestinians as well. And the political mission that is imposed on you, the liberatory political mission that is imposed on you, becomes by itself some sort of occupation of the literary process and occupation of your mind when you write literature. So you are in a place where you have to write about politics. You have to write about your historical narrative in order to be considered Palestinian and seen by the world as Palestinian. And this happened, again, let's return a little bit to the idea of literature in general. This happened in a place where you as a Palestinian is writing to the big world of literature in order to be received, for example, in Sant Jordi in Barcelona, or in any other big festival or book fair in Frankfurt, or get the Nobel Prize, or I don't know which prize to be get and to be translated to, etc., etc. So literature is not a product of the Palestinian community that reproduce the Palestinian community. It's a product that has a demand in Europe and the United States, that there are resources, huge resources of money, of residency, of prizes, to be lecturing in universities, etc., etc., that you are, as a Palestinian writer, as a careerist and a professional in writing and literature, this is what you look at. And this is where you are focused on. Now, this is natural because you are an oppressed people. You see the whole world running toward this big world and sphere of literature and creative arts and etc. And you are in your own world. You cannot even have a bookstore without it being bombed or without it being closed, or you cannot have a literature club without it being closed and you being arrested by the Israelis in Nablus, for example, or in Jenin, or in many other cities. Or a more structural oppression that is, you don't have a university, you don't have resources, you don't have anything like this that can make your literature yours. You cannot own your literature. So literature is also always addressing an imaginary, not imaginary, but a European or American reader that we imagine. Because again, Palestinian literature is being made, is being structured within a globalized industry of literature worldwide. And therefore, it plays according to those rules. The question that I keep asking myself, what makes a Palestinian literature? What if a Palestinian writer wants to write erotic literature, wants to write a romantic novel about nature and philosophical questions that are not related to Palestine? What if a Palestinian writer wants to write his memories on the beach without talking any word about his experience under colonialism? Is it a Palestinian literature? Will it be considered in the world of Palestinian literature? Will it be translated as Palestinian literature or read as a Palestinian literature? This is the paradox where not writing about the colonialism itself, or not writing directly about the suffer, and not doing the political mission of proving your narrative to the world, this is by itself the literature of liberation. One of your ways to liberate yourself from the colonization, one of your ways to liberate yourself from what is imposed upon you as a Palestinian writer, to free your mind and free your intellect, is actually to be able, first of thing, to be able to liberate yourself from this urge, from this push, from this need, from this burden of documenting and archiving. That you have to keep yourself and fight in order to keep yourself as a Palestinian writer, as a fictional writer, as a person of aesthetics, as a person of philosophy, as a person of observation, of being open to all sorts of questions and dilemmas and paradoxes and contradictions, and not becoming some sort of cool historian. Because huge amount of Palestinian literature is cool historians who have beautiful language. And this is for itself a colonization of the language and colonization of the literature. Because we tend to always think of literature as a free and liberated sphere where we can express ourselves and we can say whatever we want and we can... No, literature is an organism. Again, it's a living organism like everything in Palestine. The economy is colonized in Palestine. Society is colonized. Education is colonized. Everything is colonized in Palestine. Also, literature is colonized in Palestine. How literature is colonized? It's colonized by limiting and suffocating its abilities, its freedom, and more importantly, it's daring to challenge the forms. And maybe this is the most important things in all. Because it's not only about the content that we want. And to think of, also to think of literature of liberation, like if I want to liberate literature and think in a free way about literature, I have to ignore my people and ignore my suffer and ignore my struggle and ignore everything I lived. No, I'm not saying that. But I'm saying that what needs to judge a literature, if it's liberatory or not, is not the content itself. The content must be free, must decide to tackle the most complicated political issues and say the most radical political expression, but it needs to be also free to talk about flowers and butterflies. So what judge a liberatory literature today, in my opinion, is its ability to challenge the forms of its production, to challenge the industrial mentality, the industrial forces, the industrial structure and rituals and habits of the literary work. And more than that, to develop a literary process and a literary life that is only focusing on a Palestinian reader and on an Arab reader. That the approach of the literature is approach for the people who are suffering. So I don't want to go to my grandmother and steal her stories in order to sell them for the London book, London Review book. I don't even remember what's the name. I don't want to steal my stories, the stories of my grandmother, in order to make a TV show for Netflix to prove to the world how Palestinians suffer. I want to have a conversation with my grandmother, because after what she suffered, she deserves to be looked at the eye as an equal human and talk to her and ask her what she thinks and what she imagines, and tell her what I think and what I imagine. Blame her for things, appreciate her for things, having a dialogue with her. But what we have today is some sort of colonizing literature that deals with Palestine and with Palestinians, even from us as Palestinians, as a resource of stories, resource of content that we want to resell and reproduce to the West to watch and to gain our career and appreciation and prizes and residencies and translations. So for me, I don't want to think of Palestinian literature, because this is not this. This is what I'm saying is true to all the oppressed nations and community in the whole world. Is that our mission is to stop presenting ourselves to the huge capitalist industry of literature that is dominated by the West, and start developing aesthetics, literature, writing, discourse, dialogue that sees the oppressed as the first recipient. It sees the oppressed as the observer that we need to convince, that we need to talk to, that we need to approach. And this is very different, because this observer, my grandmother, she knows the story. I don't need to convince her with the story. She knows the story, I know the story, we know everything. So what I need to do in order to convince her that I'm a good writer, that this literature is actually worth reading, although she is an alphabet and she cannot read, is how I recreate and reinvent the forms of writings, the styles of writings, the way I produce books, the way I publish, the way I read, the way I use fonts, the way I change the covers of the books. If I need cover, I don't know. So this is the approach, or this is, I'm not saying that it's a for-granted approach, that it's not a manifesto for let's do 1, 2, 3, what's now. But I'm saying that this is a perspective, and this is a position that we need to start thinking of if we want really to return to some sort of importance for literature that can actually affect the materialist world, that can actually make difference in the world. Because we cannot, after the genocide in Gaza, we cannot keep talking about literature without criticizing ourselves, without understanding that the literature we wrote, the word that we wanted always to be so part of literature, of book fairs, of prizes, etc., is the same word that enabled the genocide. And it's the same word that enabled the starvation of children for 2 years. And if we are part of this world, we have to question ourselves. If our literature was part of this world, if our literature couldn't be part of a world, of a universe that actually challenged the genocide and stopped the genocide, we have to ask ourselves big questions. Not only, because what is happening now is just people are just want to clap for Palestinian literature and for solidarity movement, and we just want to appreciate ourselves and celebrate ourselves. But what the real questions that needs to be asked, we need to remind ourselves that we failed in protecting a child in Gaza. We failed in bringing one piece of bread to Gaza with all our institutions and all our cultures and all our humanity, culture and opera and. So we need, each person of us, we need to start questioning the world that we lived in before the genocide. This is the world that enabled genocide. So we need to start questioning everything we did, every process we did, every ideology we had in our mind, every way of producing, every way of publishing, every way of existing, and to rethink our humanity itself, our essence itself as people, our cultures, to rethink them as something that needs a very, very fundamental reform. After the Holocaust, no one talked about, okay, so what's with the ceasefire now? What is with this president and this hostages? The questions that were asked about after the Holocaust were existential and huge philosophical questions regarding the whole European culture in general and domination of capitalism and division of labor and psychology, etc., etc. And I think that the life of Palestinians, the life of Gazans are not less than that. And that's why for me as a writer, it's my ethical duty as a human, as a writer, to ask myself, is what I'm doing in my life, is it part of the world that I want to live in? Is writing and being translated to English and being translated to French and being celebrated in Hôtel de Ville in Paris, is this what the world I want to live in? And that's why, for myself, the answer that is not clear and not obvious and not direct is that the literary mission, the human mission, the cultural mission, the aesthetical mission for me today is to re-question not what I write, but how I write. Not the content of my literature, but the forms and structures and operations and infrastructure and institutions and rituals of the literary work. Thank you a lot for hearing me, and thank you for being here. And I hope I made my points clear. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for that. I think you've given us a lot to really think about, especially when it comes to the place that you see, or the role that you see literature playing nowadays. And actually, I was quite interested and moved by what you were talking about, the decolonization of Palestinian literature. And as you were talking about that, I couldn't help but remember or recall a similar movement, I guess, among, you could say, African-American filmmakers and authors, because I come from the United States originally, and I remember that there was a period of time where it was very much à la mode. It was very much, you know, to make these films that were all about, you know, gangsters in the hood. And so there was lots of money for that. But then, you know, if an African-American person wanted to just make some other movie, you know, about love, or maybe, you know, about having a, you know, a same-sex affair or something, there was no one was interested, you know, or like it didn't serve a purpose. And so what you were saying kind of really resonated with me in that regard. But I suppose the question that I have for you is that to just sort of elaborate on that a little bit more, insofar as, you know, because in the West, it's true, I think we have very little idea of what Palestinian literature is, and the variety of Palestinian authors. And it's true, pretty much, I think most works that get translated into European languages are precisely those types of works that discuss, you know, the problem, right, or the issue. And so, you know, I would be really interested in just kind of knowing a little bit more about who these other Palestinian writers are, or what other you know, ideas, you know, beyond those topics. Like, who are the people that are writing these things? Is there kind of a movement? How do these sorts of writers, if they exist, what kinds of dialogues or conflicts are they having with other Palestinian writers who, as you say, maybe feel constrained, or maybe feel like their mission is to sort of write about the problem? So, you know, I would be really interested in hearing you say a little bit more about that.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned the African-American context. I remember 3 years ago, 1 year before the war, we in Haifa, in my city, we had something we called the Little Festival that was dedicated to representing this sort of revolutionary art movements that actually challenged the form of making movies. And one of the main central things were the LA rebellion in cinema, for example. So this was one of the most inspiring for many people to see these movies that we would never watch, not in a cinema, not on the TV, not anywhere else. This is, for example. I cannot point to a specific movement in Palestine, which is also good, which is also not a big problem. But I think that it's difficult to understand the variety and the amount of currents and groups that are actually functioning in Palestine. There is an insane variety. I will tell you why. Let's start from Gaza. In Gaza, you have 2 generations minimum of very different writers that each one of them has a very, very, very different approach to literature, one that is more connected to the discourse of the West Bank, of Palestine, of the return, of all this, that their knowledge and their literary language was shaped from the age, from the years where there were still a common common intifada, common history of the Palestinians, where even they relate sometimes to an age of Palestinians that grew up outside Palestine and returned in the 90s with the Oslo Accords. And this is another generation, you have to remember, there is another generation that was never outside Gaza. People who grew up in the 90s, even in the beginning of the 2000s, and they grew up with the siege, prohibited from leaving Gaza totally. They never saw anyone from the West Bank, from Jerusalem, from 48. They never saw anyone from outside Gaza. So they have another voice of literature that is totally different and totally unique. And you can see, and this is very important. This is a very important point because, I'll tell you why. Because you can see that because they don't have the notion of leaving Gaza, they have a stronger movement of reading and writing among themselves. And this is something very important that we have to understand about Gaza before the genocide. That because the inability to leave Gaza, because of the siege and the blockade, we can see that there's a huge amount of works untranslated. No one heard about them, not only in the West, maybe even in Palestine. And the big community of literature, of literary journals, of literary events that is only having a conversation within the people of Gaza. And then, of course, there is the people that manage to find a way to go out and to start to study in a Western university, to be translated. Of course, there is a lot of different experiences, but this is only in Gaza. We are talking about two generations, two groups, one that is unable to leave Gaza, one is that able to leave Gaza, because there are people who doesn't have a direct political affiliation, doesn't have any relationship with the resistance or with the political fraction that are natural part of the Palestinian society, and those maybe can leave could leave Gaza before the war mode. So this ability of traveling or not traveling also create a difference in how you write and how you perceive literature, And also within this, you have two political fractions in Gaza that were historically in Gaza. Islamic fraction, Islamic sector, a more secular sector. And both of them have also different approaches to literature. Both of them have different languages and different way of publishing and different ways of producing literature and talking about literature. So this is only Gaza. Okay, you go to the West Bank, you have 1,000 way to think of it and 1,000 way to understand who is writing what. In 48, the areas occupied in 48 were so-called Israel, and we as Palestinians, I live in Haifa, we are forced to have Israeli citizenship. Also, there is a big difference between different schools of literature, because, for example, there is the older school of literature that grew up in the Communist Party, which was the main political power that represented Palestinians in 48, which big names, huge names of the Palestinian literature came from there, like Ibn al-Habibi, Mahmoud Darwish, Samih al-Qasim, the main poets and writers, like not the main, but the biggest names in Palestinian literature came from that area, from this party, and until today it produces a lot of names and works. There are people who grew up in different movements, in more radical movement, Marxist movement, even nationalist movement that came from other political perspective. There is also reactionary writers and poets who works for the Israelis and works for the Israeli institutions. So there is a huge variety, and this is all, okay, this is before talking about Lebanon, about Syria, about Jordan, about amazing writers in the diaspora, in the United States, everywhere in the world, okay? So there is an amazing, huge variety of experiences. And this is really one of the most unique things about Palestinian literature, that there is huge sort of experiences that are unsimilar to each other, And each one of them brings different voice. The problem becomes that most of them are not changing the forms, but there are experiences that are actually trying to challenge, and there is not a lot, to be honest and to be frank. But I think Gaza and what was happening in Gaza, mainly before the genocide, was the most interesting experience. I think in theater there was something in my city, in Haifa, that was revolutionary a little bit in the last 15 years, that there was experiences in theater and theoretical writer mainly that were revolutionary and really tried to challenge the way we produce theater and we think of dramatic and performative arts in general. This is, in short, I know that I took a lot of time, but yeah.
Oh, thank you. Yes. Did you want to?
Sí, és que hi ha moltíssimes coses que va obrir el Majd Kayyal, però moltíssimes coses, i estic d'acord amb moltes coses, i en altres podem discutir, com sempre, com Majd Lliçó. Clar, el que està parlant Majd Kayyal sobre com la llenguatge dels escriptors palestins a Gaza i després també a Cisjordània i el 48 i després a l'exili, i també no hi ha cap grup o cap escola sembla l'altra, perquè també les condicions són diferents. Per exemple, quan parlem de la literatura dels palestins al Líban i a Síria, és altre context diferent, no? Però també hi ha el títol, perquè tot el que va passar amb els palestins té un arrel molt clar. És la fundació de l'estat sionista, no? Per tant, sí que jo crec que ens va fer també aquesta diversitat de llenguatge i de condicions i tenir també problemes diferents ens va fer literàriament molt rics, pràcticament. Jo crec que anem molt poc de temps i no podem profunditzar algunes idees, però sí. I estic també ràpidament a això, el tema de la com es tracta des de l'Occident també. Vol dir, des de l'Occident, com es tracta la literatura palestina i què estem presentant i per què i no sé què. Per exemple, dic una cosa ràpidament. Després de Frankfurt, i recorda Majd Kayyal perfectament, quan van anul·lar o censurar la novel·la d'un detall menor d'Adeni Ashebli. No? Aquesta novel·la es va traduir a tot. Jo la vaig traduir al català, pràcticament. Però dic, no perquè no m'agrada, no dic perquè no m'agrada Adeni Ashebli. Adeni Ashebli és una escriptora de les nostres escriptores molt potentes, però per què esperen, per exemple, fins que arribem que passi Gaza i censurar una obra, un premi d'una escriptora palestina a Frankfurt, després pensem a traduir-ho a les llengües indoeuropees. Jo crec que la nostra feina també com palestins, com escriptors palestins, acadèmics, gent que treballa des de la universitat, també aquesta cosa, també presentar, parlar de la nostra literatura. Això és molt important. La segona cosa també, no renunciar al nostre espai. Per exemple, jo porto aquí 12 anys. Hi ha una cosa que no m'agrada, que em facin. Me truquen i dic no per moltes coses. Me truquen, em diuen, volem fer una conversa entre un escriptor palestí i un escriptor israelià. Dic, sisplau, ara, dona'm-nos un CD. Vull dir que, què és aquesta idea? Anem a posar un israelià, i no diuen israelià, diuen jueu, una trampa. No diuen. Perquè si dius no, comencen, perquè... I Majd Kayyal jo l'he trucat una vegada l'any passat, al principi del genocidi, l'he dit, quina aquesta escriptora israelí que em pots dir? Perquè és també... Sempre torno a parlar amb ell, quina aquesta escriptora israelí que porten a aquest festival? I quina aquesta moda també de posar un palestí i un... És com, ara també he de... Però jo crec que també aquí tenim una responsabilitat de no renunciar al nostre espai, perquè jo crec que també a Catalunya tinc un lloc natural, també és una part de la meva cultura, avui de dia, després de 12 anys, després de fer escriure teatre en català, després de fer filologia catalana. No puc renunciar a això per altra persona que em ve de Tel Aviv. També és el meu espai, però també hi ha una feina aquí que cal fer. Lo sento, però era important això. Gràcies.
It's just that we have to really...
Sí.
So thank you. I just wanted to say thank you once again for your talk and for your time. And I'm very sorry, but we have to close things now. But we wish you all the very best.
Bon dia, benvolguts, benvolgudes. Unes paraules breus de cloenda, si em permeteu, per tancar aquest acte d'inauguració del curs acadèmic organitzat des del Departament, des de la Facultat d'Humanitats. Bé, directora, degana, equip de direcció, equip de deganat, col·legues, personal del PTGAS, tècnics, estudiants, tothom que heu vingut a compartir avui aquest acte. Moltes gràcies a la Facultat per convocar-nos. És un tema el que s'ha tractat que efectivament preocupa a tota la comunitat universitària. I volia agrair molt especialment, tot i que no sé si em sentirà o si entendrà la traducció, a l'escriptor Kayyal pel que ens ha explicat. Tant de bo la literatura palestina sigui no només una literatura, com ha dit, dedicada a la causa, sinó també d'alliberament. I gràcies, Linda i Mohamad, per presentar l'acte i per aquesta conversa, tot i breu, molt substancial. Cal dir que l'escriptor convidat a fer aquesta lliçó ha renunciat a cobrar honoraris per aquesta xerrada i els destina a una causa, a una organització, una causa en solidaritat amb Palestina. Doncs doblement agraïts per aquest gest tan solidari. I bé, deia que aquest tema que ens convoca ens preocupa i recordo molt breument que recentment un filòsof italià, Massimo Cacciari, expressava amb molta contundència sobre Gaza que la diferència substancial respecte a d'altres violacions dels drets humans que s'han anat succeint és que malgrat que ens omplim la boca de valors occidentals, en aquest cas, el principi que hem menystingut és un principi inviolable. Deia que fins i tot a Ucraïna s'enfronten dos exèrcits i que en canvi aquí és un exèrcit el que bombardeja i massacra columnes de pròfugs, nens i dones. Una guerra contra civils, un salt qualitatiu que no podríem traspassar. Què podem fer, doncs, davant aquest genocidi? Temps foscos, ha dit la degana. Si em permeteu, jo llegiré un fragment d'una obra d'Italo Calvino on parla de l'infern. L'infern dels vius, diu Calvino, no és quelcom que serà. Si n'hi ha un, és aquell que ja està aquí, l'infern que habitem tots els dies, que formem estant junts. Hi ha dues maneres per no patir-lo. La primera resulta fàcil per molts, és acceptar l'infern, esdevenir-ne part fins al punt de no veure'l més. La segona és arriscar-se, i aquesta segona via exigeix atenció i aprenentatge continus. Buscar i saber reconèixer qui i què enmig de l'infern no és infern, i fer-lo durar i donar-li espai. Aquesta cita de les citats invisibles la reprodueix Nuccio Ordine en el seu llibre dedicat als clàssics. Per què llegir clàssics? Per què recórrer a l'educació clàssica? I bé, Nuccio Ordine no només ens interpel·la a llegir clàssics, sinó també a triar el que ens pertoca a cadascun de nosaltres, escollir la via de la indiferència o bé escollir la via del compromís, un compromís per sobreviure a allò que en l'infern no és infern. Bé, és per això que crec que les humanitats són imprescindibles, tal com ens ha demostrat l'acte al que ens heu convocat avui. Moltes gràcies. I ara hi ha un pica-pica per brindar.